Okay, hi. So in this video we're going to talk about environmental change and how we measure it and how it actually affects the distribution of different organisms. So we've had a look at adaptations and competition, but if the environment of an organism changes very quickly, then sometimes they don't have the ability to adapt that quickly, and that can affect the distribution of that organism and others as well. And so there are a number of factors in the environment which will affect the distribution of those organisms. So there are a number of factors. I'm just going to list them here. One of them will be the temperature. So the temperature. For example, if you had, well, let's just take the UK. In the UK, the average temperature is probably around about 15 degrees. And therefore, we cannot have something like a desert rat living here. That's because a desert rat requires a much higher temperature in order to survive. On the flip side, we also can't have a polar bear because a polar bear requires a much lower average temperature to survive. Would a polar bear die if it had one day at 15 degrees? Probably not. But if it was 15 degrees average all year, would the polar bear be able to survive? Probably not. And so, of course, temperature will affect what type of organisms grow. Another one is going to be the amount of rainfall. And the reason for that is, of course, some organisms are adapted better to obtaining water when there's not a lot of it around than others. Some animals require there to be loads of water around for them to be able to obtain it, whereas other sort of more desert adapted organisms are able to find water when there is barely any. Okay, it's also going to be the amount of light. Obvious reasons if you're a plant. Not so obvious, I guess, if you're an animal, but some animals are way better adapted to surviving in the dark. They have better senses, they have better sight, they also have more keen hearing and things like that. Some bats use things like sonar in order to find their prey. Whereas if an animal who normally lives in really light, well-lit environments was then put in the dark, would it be able to find food? Probably not, and that's going to affect the distribution. Okay, and we also have things like pH. If we are talking about aquatic organisms who live in water, then the pH is going to really affect whether they can survive or not. Also, you're going to have the saline content, so the amount of salt, and there are many other things as well, and we won't have time to go through all of them. Okay, and the last one though, which I will mention, is other organisms. I'll do that in a different colour, because this is obviously a biotic factor and the others are abiotic, which means not living. So organisms, if you have the introduction of a new predator that can come and eat you, then your population is probably going to go down. Likewise, if you, in an ecosystem that you live in, if your prey becomes extinct, you're going to struggle to find food and your population will probably go down. Whereas if you introduce more prey, which you can eat as well, well, then you've got loads of food and you'll probably increase your population. So different factors will affect the population. Okay, so it's important for us that we need to be able to measure these different changes, because then we can monitor exactly what's going on in a given ecosystem and we can start to explain why things are happening. And so things like temperature, rainfall, they're quite easy to measure because we can just use a thermometer to measure the temperature. We can actually physically measure the amount of rainfall, and so they're quite simple to measure. pH as well, we can just use something called a pH meter, and so that's pretty straightforward. pH meter, we can use, of course, thermometer to measure the temperature, and we'll measure rainfall using something known as a rain gauge. It's basically just a fancy funnel with rulers in it, if you like, so we can measure exactly the amount of rain. Okay, and sometimes we're going to combine data like this. So here we have a graph, And we have this green line here, or that represents the temperature. And we've also got the average rainfall. And so that is for different months. And this is going to be for a specific ecosystem. And therefore we can see patterns emerging, and we can also monitor more than one factor all in one go. So this is quite a handy way of doing things. Okay, let's just move this. Now, organisms are actually slightly harder to measure because we can't get an exact answer really. What we can do is we take samples. So for organisms, we will take samples and then we make estimates based on the size of their environment. Now, something which is very important is that we can use these samples, so these distributions of organisms, the data that we've collected on it, in order to make estimates on different changes in an environment. And one good example is these guys here. So these are known as lichens. Lichens, and they like to grow, in this case they've grown on tree bark, so they grow on tree barks, walls and different things like that. But in order for lichens to grow, the quality of the air has to be very good. And so lichens can be used as a measurement or an indication of air pollution. So that's another factor that we could measure, which is going to affect the distribution of organisms. But if we measure the amount of lichens, if we say, you know, this environment has got a lot of lichens in it, all the trees are covered in lichens, it's more than likely that the air quality is going to be very good in that environment. Whereas if we have somewhere in which none of the trees are really covered in any lichens, then we can have an estimate and we can say the air quality probably isn't that good in this environment. And so the distribution of organisms gives us a good indication of the conditions of the environment. Now, we can also use this concept when we're talking about marine animals or marine organisms. So if you have a look here, we've got a chart which tells you which organisms will survive at different pHs. And this is just a section of a chart. We'll also go to different pHs as well. But let's say, for example, that in our lake or whatever it is, we had frogs and perch, but we didn't have any other organisms. So we had these guys, but no one else could survive there. Well, that could tell us that the pH of the lake is likely quite harsh, and therefore other organisms won't survive. And from here we can see that perch and frogs will both survive at pH 4.5 and pH 4.0, whereas all the other organisms by then have died because they can't handle it. So the distribution of organisms, so the organisms give us an idea of the water's pH. They could also tell us different characteristics of the water, different types of water pollution. Different organisms respond differently to different types of pollutant, and depending on what we're looking for, that could give us some useful information as well. Okay, so now we use one example of why it's important to measure the different factors which are affecting the distribution of different organisms. So we're going to use the example of this guy here, and this is obviously a honeybee. Honeybee. Now, it's a well-known fact in the UK that the population of the honeybees are going down. And a lot of you might think, well, that's a good thing, right? Because when they sting you, it hurts and they're just a nuisance. They buzz around and they don't really do much. Well, that's not actually true. They pollinate so many different plants that a lot of fruits are only possible because of the honeybee doing its job. And so therefore it is quite worrying that the population is going down. Well, why is it going down? Now, there are a few theories. One of them is the climate change theory. Climate change. Perhaps the fact that our average temperature is going up means that the bee is not coping very well because it was already adapted to live in slightly colder environments. Another theory is that disease is spreading through the honeybee. So disease carried by a pathogen So there's a pathogen which it's thought is going to be a like a small mite, which is carrying this pathogen, is finding its way to the bees and infecting bees and killing them. And this is reducing their population. And this is a problem, of course, especially for farmers who rely on the bees to allow them to grow some of their fruit. And so there is a lot of effort being put into breeding resistant bees to certain diseases. There are various other factors which may be causing it as well. One of them might be the insecticides used by farmers on their crops to stop harmful insects from eating all their crops, and these might be taken up by the bees, and eventually the levels of insecticide which are going around within the bees are getting too high, and this can cause them to die as well. Okay, so it's important that a lot of the reasons why we are aware of this, so we are aware of the bee population. What actually allows us to do this is the fact that we can measure environmental change. So we can measure the environmental change, and therefore we can start to try and combat the problem, which is going to ultimately affect us in the long run. So that's the importance of measuring the environmental change, and here are the impacts of environmental change as well. You can get things which are important, such as these bees, actually dying out, and that is going to be a massive problem. Okay, so that was a quick overview really. There are other examples as well. You might see some in your textbook, but I just wanted to cover the main points. If you do have any questions, then please do leave them in the comment box below or send me an email using the link, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.